Today, we're diving into the invisible engine of the global economy. And no, it's not a commodity like oil, and it's not some new technology like AI or data. It's something, well, it's something much more human. And it has the power to build fortunes, or, as we'll see, trigger a complete global collapse. So let me ask you this. What do you think is the single most powerful force driving the global economy? I mean, what's really behind the massive booms that create jobs and wealth, and also the sudden, terrifying busts that can just wipe it all away in an instant? We all feel these cycles, right? But what's the engine? Well, here's the thing. The answer isn't a hard number you can just look up on a spreadsheet. It's a collective human sentiment. It's a feeling. And that feeling is confidence, the shared belief, or the sudden lack of it, and what the future holds. To really understand just how powerful this feeling is, we first need to take a look at what happens when it completely vanishes. And there is no better or more painful example than the 2008 global financial crisis, because it wasn't just a banking crisis. At its core, it was a crisis of confidence that brought the entire world's economy to a screeching halt. In the wake of the crash, the impact was immediate and, honestly, just staggering. Global trade, the very lifeblood of our interconnected world, it collapsed by a third in 2009. Think about that. The economic arteries of the planet basically froze solid. And that freeze wasn't just some problem for Wall Street. This quote really gets to the heart of it. Even perfectly healthy, successful companies suddenly couldn't get the short-term loans, that liquidity, they needed for the basics, like paying their suppliers or even just making payroll. The whole system just seized up. And the real-world impact was absolutely devastating. In China alone, an estimated 67,000 factories went bankrupt. Why? Because orders from around the world just vanished overnight. This wasn't some distant financial problem anymore. This was a full-blown supply chain catastrophe. What happened next is a textbook example of something economists call the bullwhip effect. It's a great name, actually. Imagine cracking a whip, a tiny flick of your wrist, right? But that creates this huge, violent wave at the very end. Well, in economics, a small drop in consumer spending does the exact same thing. It creates a massive, amplified shockwave that travels all the way up the supply chain. And here's exactly how that played out in the real world. During the crisis, demand for things like consumer electronics here in the US fell by about 8%. Okay, that's a dip, but it's not catastrophic. But for the companies making the semiconductor chips inside those products, for them, demand plummeted by a staggering 20%. That small ripple at the cash register became a tidal wave for the suppliers. But the bullwhip effect just describes what happened. To really understand why it happened, we've got to turn to some fascinating research that pinpoints the real trigger for this global meltdown. So what was it? What was the root cause of this sudden synchronized panic? It wasn't just about bad loans. It was the collapse of that invisible engine we talked about at the very beginning. Okay, this slide right here, this is the smoking gun. These two charts at the top track global business and consumer confidence. For decades, you can see them sort of ebb and flow. But then look at what happens around 2008. Both lines fall off an absolute cliff at the exact same moment. That catastrophic drop in confidence wasn't just a symptom of the crisis, it was the cause. And believe it or not, researchers can actually measure this stuff. They take all these different business and consumer surveys from dozens of countries, and they find the common global factor, basically a single number that represents the collective optimism or pessimism of the entire world economy. But here's a really important distinction. Not all confidence is created equal. Business confidence, that's mostly about sales forecasts, what companies expect to sell. But consumer confidence is much, much broader. It captures what the famous economist John Maynard Keynes called animal spirits, our collective gut feeling about the future. It's not just about what we plan to buy. It's also about our feelings about our job security, our neighbor's job security, the whole health of the economy. And because consumer confidence is so broad, it has this incredible predictive power. In fact, when you really look at the data, you can see exactly how a change in our collective feeling translates directly into hard economic facts. Get a load of this. Research shows that shocks to global consumer confidence, those sudden shifts in optimism or pessimism, can explain a quarter of the variation in global factory output and another quarter of the variation in global unemployment. A quarter. That is a massive, massive share. It shows just how much our collective mood really dictates our economic reality. Now, I know these charts might look a little complicated, but they show something really simple and incredibly powerful. On the left, a boost to business confidence leads to a rise in industrial production. You see that in the top left chart. Good, right? But now, look at the top right. An identical boost to consumer confidence creates a much bigger, much faster spike in production. Our collective feeling about the future is, simply put, a more powerful economic engine. So, after all that pain and chaos, what was the lesson? Well, the 2008 crisis forced companies everywhere to completely rethink how they operate and to shift away from this single-minded obsession they had with cutting costs, no matter what the risk was. Before 2008, the name of the game was cost reduction, period. And that led to these incredibly long, complex, and super fragile supply chains. After the crisis, the focus did a complete 180. It shifted dramatically to risk management and reliability. Suddenly, stability became way more valuable than just saving a few pennies. And this led to a whole new playbook. Now, companies rigorously assess the financial health of all their partners. They're shortening their supply chains, bringing production closer to home in a process called nearshoring. And maybe most importantly, they're prioritizing reliable partners who can actually deliver, even in a crisis, over just picking the absolute cheapest option available. So, the key takeaway here is pretty clear. The global economy isn't just a machine of inputs and outputs. It's powered by human confidence. The 2008 crisis taught businesses a very hard lesson in building resilient systems that can withstand a shock to that confidence. And that leaves us with one final, pretty important question to think about. What will we be forced to learn next?